Hello and welcome, everyone. This is our 5th session out of 9, which technically and also not technically makes this the central session of our course. Tonight's topic is the Talmud, which is an especially appropriate subject because in many ways, since its completion, the Talmud has served as the central canonical text of Judaism. At the same time, I would argue that the Talmud may also be seen as the central problem of Judaism, so to speak, at least of modern Judaism, not non-capital, modern. It is a huge text written in its own genre, and I would say also it's an original way of thought. One cannot really approach it without outside help. And I will admit that I did not see a page of Talmud until I was in my mid-20s. But I can absolutely say that that experience fundamentally altered my understanding of the Jewish mind and my ability to join what is often called the Jewish conversation. And for that reason, when we came to plan this course, the session on the Talmud was perhaps the first one that we set down and outlined. Tonight, we are lucky to have with us a scholar who not only works on the Talmud, but whose last book is entitled The Talmud, a Biography, no less, Professor Barry Wimpheimer of Northwestern University. A native New Yorker, Wimpheimer received rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva University and a PhD in religion from Columbia University, where his 2005 dissertation was awarded the Salo and Janet Barron Prize in Jewish Studies. Before coming to Northwestern, Wimpheimer was a professor at Penn State and a Harry Starr Fellow at Harvard. His first book, Narrating the Law, Poetics of Talmudic Legal Stories, was published in 2011. The Talmud, a Biography, was published earlier this year by Princeton University Press. We are very honored and lucky to have with us Professor Barry Wimpheimer.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I first want to say that I want to acknowledge the fact that my predecessor in this series, Gary Horton, has honored me with his presence, so I'm flattered, Gary. I also wanted to thank Yiftach and Margaret, who have, I think, endowed this whole series, and to thank Yiftach for having a conversation with me last week to give me an update about where this class has been, what kinds of texts and conversations have been going on in this series, so that I could present my remarks and think about how mine would fit in with the things that have come before. And because I'm doing that, I'm actually going to do things very differently than maybe I have in other places, as in my book, or some of you have mentioned that you've heard me speak in some places. So I'm gonna try to start in a completely different place than I've started in the past. And I have to say that Professor Horton's prior talk really helps me set this up, because my impression of the prior talk and the materials is that it was primarily midrash focused. And so it was primarily oriented towards the aspect of biblical interpretation in rabbinic literature. And one of the other very important aspects of rabbinic literature is the legal aspect of rabbinic literature, the tendency to produce law codes. And so I'm going to start tonight way before the rabbinic period. I'm going to try to get us back to the earliest history of law codes and start and try to frame what's going on in the Talmud and try to understand what the rabbis are doing in the Talmud in light of much earlier forces in the world. So, what is the earliest law code that you are familiar with? Hammurabi, okay? I noticed none of you said Exodus 22. There's no attempt to say that the Bible is older than Hammurabi in the room? No? Is Hammurabi the oldest legal code that the world possesses? It is not. Hammurabi, does anyone have an idea of like what century it's from? Very good. 18th century BCE. It's either 1800 or 1750. But we actually have, from that part of the world, from the ancient Near East, also known as Mesopotamia, from that area of the world, archaeologists have dug up law codes that were preserved in cuneiform tablets, and from which we can get a picture of what law used to be. The earliest ones are actually from the 21st century. We have some Hittite law codes. So we have Sumerian law codes. We have some law codes that are a little older than Hammurabi. And what's amazing is that these 19th century archaeological digs that dug up all of the cities of Babylon, as well as Syria, Israel, and unearthed all kinds of interesting libraries. From Assyria, one of the biggest libraries is from Assyria, the library of Ashurbanipal, who's a figure who appears in the Bible. These libraries have given us a number of these different codes. So we now have 7 or 8 real codes from the ancient period, and then fragments of other pieces. What's interesting about these codes, and people sometimes don't realize this, is that it seems to us, by the latest scholarship, that these codes were not law codes in the way we think of law codes. When we think of law codes, we think of law as a practical entity. We think of it on a state model. We think of law as something that is legislated, and then it is distributed. It is either observed or it is violated, and when it is violated, it is punished. Law is enforced. And that's the kind of way we think about law. But actually, in the case of the ancient Near Eastern law codes, scholars are gravitating towards the conclusion that these law codes were likely never enacted as policy. They were scholastic documents. They were fodder for scholars to chew on and think through some of the thorny issues of civilization that they encountered. Not only did they chew on it, but they also, after masticating it, passed it forward to the next generation, so that when we look at an 18th century Hammurabi law code, it is in dialogue with the 21st century BCE earlier codes. Which is why when we get to the Torah, and we get to the Bible and its law codes, such as the book of Exodus is what's called often the Covenant Code, Exodus chapter 21, 22. When we get to the Covenant Code and we see that the Covenant Code overlaps extensively with Hammurabi's code, it isn't entirely shocking, because it's clear that the Covenant Code is written on the basis of Hammurabi. In fact, a scholar from Brandeis University a few years ago put out a book in which he argued that it is literally built on Hammurabi's code, that if you take the structure of Hammurabi and you put the book of Exodus next to it, you can see exactly how you get from text A to text B. So you have this rich tradition of scholastic law, a law that is thought of as something that people ruminate on and think about as a way of articulating the world they live in. It gets preserved in the Hebrew Bible. Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, we have 3 such law codes. One in Exodus, one in Leviticus, one in Deuteronomy. Bible scholars sometimes divide these into even smaller groups, and you could do that. There's sections of it that might originally have been different documents. But for our purposes, there are these 3 law codes in the Bible. And guess what? Bible scholars say that the priests and the scribes who are responsible for having produced the original law codes before they were embedded in the Torah as we now have them, were likely producing them entirely for scholastic purposes and not for practical purposes, with the possible exception of the sections of the book of Leviticus that are about how you bring sacrifices, that seem to be more of a manual. Now, Simi Chevelle was here a few weeks ago, and Simi's a good friend of mine, and he's very much up on biblical history, and I know he likely framed the Bible in terms of different, did he talk about Persian period, and did he talk about, so he probably talked about Iron Age and Bronze Age, and then he got into Persian period. He talked about how you transition from the pre-Babylonian exile to post-Babylonian exile. Did we talk about some of this? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to review, the big dates in Jewish history, in roughly 587 BCE, well, before that. 1000 BCE was celebrated in the year 2000 CE. The state of Israel came out with a big commemoration in 2000. It was 3,000 years since what? Does anyone remember? Yeah. Yes, it was 3,000 years since King David had come and founded Jerusalem. 3,000 years since David, because David supposedly is from 1000 BC. David is a high water mark in biblical Judaism, because David, despite all the negative stories about him in the Bible, David was a very important political figure. The territory controlled by the Israelites under David's control was larger than at any portion in the rest of biblical history. David was a fighter, and he consolidated lots of territory under his control. The map that you get from the Bible in its biblical description of the broadest features of the map of Israel, this is relevant for today's politics as well, they're a function of the areas that were controlled under David's reign. David was the one who controlled the largest amount of territory. But David's reign didn't last very long. The high water mark, the peak period of Jewish history, the united monarchy, was maybe 70 years long. Saul, replaced by David, replaced by Solomon, and then after Solomon, around 920 BCE, there's a rift that happens, a coup happens, and the united monarchy bifurcates into a divided monarchy. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, Rechavam in Hebrew, is the king of the southern kingdom. Jeroboam, Yeravam, is the king of the northern kingdom, and they would not come back together again. There was a rift that happens in 922 to 920 BCE. For 200 years, these kingdoms live alongside one another, until in 722, the northern kingdom angers the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrians come in and they destroy the northern kingdom. Ashurbanipal, who I mentioned earlier, who had this big library and stored Hammurabi and various other works in their best condition, is one of the people responsible for routing and eliminating the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom gets destroyed at roughly 722 BCE. And the southern kingdom lives by itself without its northern brother or sister until 587 BCE. In 587 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, which replaces the Assyrian Empire, comes in and destroys Jerusalem, destroys Judea, and exiles the elite populations. The elite populations that it exiles were the royal family, and anyone who had a member of the Judean family who might aspire to take over the monarchy, the priests who ran the temple, the wealthy, and the scribes, the people who were necessary to the literary production of books, and who were the kind of intelligentsia of the Judeans around Judea in Jerusalem around 587. And so all these people get transported to Babylonia. There in Babylonia, they do something that was unheard of in prior world history. They create a kingdom in exile and perpetuate a culture in exile. So prior to this, what typically happened was if an empire took you over and transported you to its capital city, you became a member of the dominant culture and you disappear from world history. Why don't we know of anything about the northern Israelites? Because the Assyrians relocate them all over the Assyrian Empire. They take them back to the capital of Assyria, and they become completely assimilated into Assyrian life, and we never hear from them ever again. Because that was typical. What's unusual is what happens in 587. When the Judeans go to Babylonia, and this elite community in exile decides, we're going to be committed to perpetuating ourselves. We're going to be committed to perpetuating the values that this elite population had already started to produce before the temple's destruction. And those values had started to be embodied in the Torah, which had started to be written before the period of the destruction of the first temple. But, and much of the second part of Tanakh, the Nevi'im section, was also written in the period before the destruction of the first temple. And if you now know what I'm talking about, go back and read the Nevi'im section, and your eyes will open, because you will read between the lines, and you will see that it was written by scribes loyal to the southern kingdom, and they have lots of negative things to say about the northern kingdom, little asides here and there, which you'll now appreciate, because these are their relatives, and they remember that there was once a unified kingdom that they were part of, but they're now not really the same family. There is also, if you read between the lines, you will see that during the first temple period, the ideology that we think of as the ideology of the prophets, an ideology built on centralized worship in Jerusalem, on sacrifices exclusively offered by the priestly elites in Jerusalem, was not something that was shared widely in the population in the countryside of Judea or Israel. There were lots of people who had backyard altars and were offering sacrifices on their own. There were also like different types of local leaders and regular iconic practices that were not so different from other pagan practices in the countryside around them. So if you read the Bible, you'll see that. And then so what happens is the elite population goes into exile and says, we are going to maintain ourselves. We're going to commit ourselves to this ideology. And they develop the ability, they start to insist for the first time on ethnic exclusivity. So they start to insist on only marrying within their group. So prior to this point, you can see lots of examples in Jewish history where that's not true, where there's absorption of other populations in neighboring areas. But starting in 586 BCE, you get a commitment to this ideology. And so the Babylonians send Ezra and Nehemiah back to Judea. And Ezra and Nehemiah in the 5th century BCE teach the populations of Judea that had been left behind. Who were the populations in Judea who had been left behind? The non-elites. Who were the non-elites? The poor people who were not literate. They were not priests. They were not royal. What do you think happened to them when their leadership class left in 587? They assimilated, right? So Ezra and Nehemiah, if you would go back now and read that section of the Ketuvim section of the Hebrew Bible, where Ezra and Nehemiah come back to the land of Israel, and they find a whole population that is intermarried, assimilated, and doesn't know anything about Judaism, right? Well, it's not surprising. That's what you would expect at the time. What's unusual is what Ezra and Nehemiah do. They take out a Torah scroll, which is very similar to our Torah scroll. They unroll it in public, and they read it to the people and say, this is your heritage. And they force the people, and there's this very tragic, sad scene in the book of Nehemiah where there's this whole scary thing where they're asking the people to get rid of their non-Jewish spouses. I have to say, just a funny aside, I hope you'll find the humor in this. I did. I was in Boston a few weeks ago because my wife's family's from Boston. I was in the JCC, and there was a fitness poster with a woman on it, and it said, it had a biblical verse from the book of Ezra, and it said, strengthen yourself. And it was like, it took out several words from the passage, and it made it look like the book of Ezra was exhorting people to work out. But actually, the passage was about telling people to send away their wives and children who were not Judean. And I had to snap a picture of it. I'm not really active on Twitter, but that really would have been a precious post, just because. But anyway, I digress. So the exciting thing that happens is that Ezra and Nehemiah teach the Torah to the people. And the Torah and text become central and foundational in a way that they hadn't been before. One of the other exciting things that happens, and I don't know if Professor Chevelle mentioned this, is a big transformation happens from before the destruction of the first temple to after. Before the destruction of the first temple, how did the people encounter God? How did they know what God wanted? How do they know? The priests could tell them? There was another institution. There are times in the Bible where the priests will consult, like the breastplate. There are times in the book of Judges and the book of Samuel where they consult the breastplate and they get like a message. But how else? What? The Urim and Tumim, but how else? Urim and Tumim is not so common. What's the more common institution in First Temple Judaism? How do they know what God wants? I'll give you a hint. It's related to the Haftorahs of the weekly service. The prophets. The prophets are a special people who are charismatically linked to God and who are God's voice box in the world, that they're the vehicle through which the people know what God wants. What happens in the Second Temple period is that prophecy ceases. There's no more prophets. So the prophet Ezekiel, one of the last of the classical prophets, he's actually in Babylonia. So he's writing his works of prophecy in Babylonia in exile. The prophet second Isaiah, who is the second half of the book of Isaiah. There's a whole debate about whether there's a third Isaiah. But the second half of the book of Isaiah is also after the destruction of the temple. The first Isaiah is before the destruction of the temple. By the time the temple gets rebuilt, around 430 BCE, You could say there's a long tradition, ancient tradition, that there was a 70-year period of exile, which would mean that in 517 BCE, the temple was rebuilt. It is possible that someone, re-inaugurated services in a hillside somewhere in Jerusalem in 517. But the temple really only gets going in around 430 BC, which is when Nehemiah really gets things going. So between 430 BCE and the destruction of the Second Temple, what year is the destruction of the Second Temple? 70 CE. So that period, 500-year period between 430 BCE and 70 CE, is the period of Second Temple Judaism. Very important period. And I think you talked a little bit last time about rewritten Bible, and you talked about translations. I saw Targumim was on the thing. During the Second Temple period, one of the major things that happens is prophecy becomes replaced by textualism. First, textualism is the production of texts. So you have a lot more literature. So in addition to the works of the Bible, like the ones from Ketuvim that were produced during this period between 430 and 70, some of the Ketuvim are produced during this period. In addition to those materials, if you're familiar with Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, I don't know if it was discussed, books that are external to the traditional canon of the Hebrew Bible, many of them come from this period. The Pseudepigrapha are called Pseudepigrapha because they are writings that attribute their authorship to a famous person. So pick a famous person that you know of from the Torah. Pick a person. Pick a person. Does that person have pseudepigrapha? So let me ask you, if you were active in the 300s BCE and you wanted to write the book that everyone would gravitate to, which figure from the Bible would you pick? And this is a very subjective thing. You can have completely different answers. Moses, right? So there is a testament of Moses, like someone did this, like this is what someone did. We've got testaments of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the 12 tribes have testaments. We have documents where people wrote as, now some of these actually make it into the Hebrew Bible, if you think about this. What pseudepigrapha exists in the Hebrew Bible? Song of Songs is attributed to Solomon, who didn't write it. What else is attributed to Solomon? What else is attributed to Solomon? Proverbs. What else? Ecclesiastes. The words of Ecclesiastes, the son of David, right? So these are three different writers in the Second Temple period who all had the same idea. Solomon is supposedly the wisest person. If I'm going to write a work, especially a work of wisdom like Proverbs, what better figure from the Bible to choose to be the author than Solomon? It didn't just end with the biblical books. There's a book called The Wisdom of Solomon, which is later than the Hebrew Bible and the works of the Hebrew Bible. So there's this textualism, rising textualism. And what happens is textualism, first it starts with more books being written to be included in the Hebrew Bible. And then it continues with people trying to capture the energy of the Hebrew Bible by either rewriting the Hebrew Bible, right? There's rewrites of the Hebrew Bible. Book of Deuteronomy is a rewrite. So that's a pretty early example of a rewrite. There is a famous rewrite, the Book of Jubilees, which you may not have heard of. Did we talk about Jubilees last time? No. Okay, so Jubilees is a fascinating story because until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the only version of Jubilees that existed in the world was a version that was preserved by the Ethiopic Church in an old Ethiopic language. On the basis of this, scholars, including one very prominent Israeli scholar, reconstructed what they imagined the original text of the Book of Jubilees was. So they didn't know if that text was written in Hebrew or Greek, but they assumed from the syntax it was probably either Hebrew or Aramaic. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found a Hebrew Book of Jubilees. And it's actually amazing. If you want to be impressed by a scholar's work, you can compare the reconstruction with the actual. It's pretty close. It's like 90%. Scholars sometimes can really do a good job reconstructing things when they have the right tools. Book of Jubilees tells the story of the Bible from the Genesis story of the creation of the world in 7 days through the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. Right? So why would someone go through the trouble of rewriting this material? The author has an agenda. The specific agenda is legal. The legal agenda of the Book of Jubilees is to clean up the behavior of the forefathers so that if they ever do anything that's kind of illegal, we can clean it up. Give you an example. When Abraham serves a meal to his visitors in the book of Genesis, what was on the menu? Meat and dairy, right? So for the author of Book of Jubilees, at this point, their understanding of kosher had evolved to the point where meat and dairy was not acceptable. So in the rewrite of that story, the menu changes, and it's not meat and dairy. There's famously an episode in Genesis where Reuben supposedly sleeps with his father's concubine. Well, that's not very kosher either. So the author of the Book of Jubilees rewrites it and says that Reuben rearranges the beds, right? The sleep schedule has changed. And so Jacob sleeps with one wife instead of another, and that's really what it means. By the way, this is a very common midrashic solution. So we talked about midrashic interpretation. Genesis Rabbah, one of the most authoritative rabbinic collections of midrash from the 5th century CE, Palestinian midrash, has this same idea of Reuben switching the beds. And from Genesis Rabbah, it ends up in Rashi, where school children are still to this day taught that this is what the meaning of this text is. But the first source that we have is the Book of Jubilees from the Second Temple period, which rewrites the Bible with this agenda in order to interpret it. My point is that textualism is happening. It's replacing prophecy, and interpretation is becoming very important. But remember, there was this old model going back to Hammurabi flowing through the Bible of law codes, of like thinking about law in theoretical ways. Which brings us back to the Dead Sea Scrolls again. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1948 or 1947. Their deciphering has been complicated by various political factors. 1948 was a pretty big year in the Dead Sea area. Took a long time for the Dead Sea Scrolls to be deciphered, but now they're all available. They're all available very easily. You can go online and see a digital version of them. Dead Sea Scrolls are fascinating. Some of the documents that we have for the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate that they were interested in law. In fact, that's actually one of the transformations that happened after 1967, when Jewish scholars started to be the primary people with access to the Dead Sea Scrolls, because Jewish scholars suddenly had control of the territory where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Amazing transformation. Prior to 1967, the only thing people were interested about the Dead Sea Scrolls was their theology. Because the only people looking at it were Christian scholars, and they were interested, what were the beliefs of this sect? They were hoping to find some proto-Christian beliefs there. After 1967, when Jewish scholars took over, they said, hey, this looks like rabbinic literature. There's a lot more in common between this and rabbinic literature, and there's a lot more law than we ever knew. There's all kinds of legal documents from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the community rule and the temple scroll. There's various law codes. Now, in this case, in some cases, like the community rule, these seem to be like manuals or handbooks for the community to operate in. But in some cases, especially the temple scroll, because they're not really controlling the temple, they're out in the Dead Sea sect of people from the Second Temple period who, out of a certain purity of doctrine and also frustration with lack of political control of the temple, decides to go to the Dead Sea area and live deliberately away from the rest of the Jews. And there, in self-imposed exile, produce a theology that excludes others. It's an us and them theology, where they have an apocalyptic idea that the world is about to end and God is going to save them. And the other Jews who are running the temple in Jerusalem are going to be in trouble because they're the them. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us a picture of this group, the biggest picture that we have of the sects from the Second Temple period. And what it shows us is these people were scholastics. They spent a lot of their time, a lot of their day, maybe even their entire day, poring over texts and doing different types of behaviors, doing different types of things with texts. One of the primary things they did with texts was they would have their Bibles. We can't really be sure what was in the Dead Sea Scroll Bible and what wasn't. A lot of their texts overlap with what's in our Bibles, but maybe they included some of the Apocrypha or the Book of Jubilees in their understanding of the Bible. Maybe they didn't even have an understanding of the Bible, of a Bible. So the picture we get is these are scholastics. They spend a lot of time doing biblical interpretation and a lot of time producing law and thinking about law in the abstract. And in this sense, they are preserving this tradition that goes back to the priests who produced the biblical law codes. Yes?
So I just want to fully understand what you mean by the philosophical idea of scholastics, but also what they were producing. You mentioned Hammurabi's code was not legal like we think of it today. It was to study, but was it to study to like derive the ideal way of living, or what was the purpose of the study if it wasn't going to be legalistic? Is that?
So that is much debated by scholars. Like, so there's one school of thought that says, you know, because the Hammurabi stuff, it's very legal. It's very, for those lawyers out there, it's case-based learning. It's, you know, it's like if you're reading the Bible and it says, you know, if one person hits another person and then this circumstance happens, who is liable? What's the liability? What's the nature of liability? It's these kinds of cases. But they're all hypotheticals, so they're not real cases. And they all seem to be designed to allow the people who are working on it to chew over what the good solution to this should be. Now, how you define good is going to differ depending on where you are.
What's an ideal society, kind of?
Kind of, but I mean, it's a very much a, like in Hammurabi's system, the king was everything. So the king has power beyond all kinds of things. One of the changes that happens when you get to the Bible is there start to be values that go above the political powers that are controlling what's going on. But I'm trying to give you a picture of where this sort of obsession with law that becomes a Jewish hallmark actually comes from. It doesn't just emerge out of nowhere. During the Second Temple period, there were sects. The sect we know the most about is the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, but we also know that there existed other sects. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are two other sects we know about. In Egypt, there was a group called the Hemerobaptists. We know about these groups from different texts that describe them in sometimes contradictory ways. We have Roman texts that describe sects. We have Jewish texts that describe texts, texts in Hebrew, texts in Aramaic, texts in Greek. We have all kinds of descriptions of sects, but the best information we have comes from the Dead Sea Scroll library, because we actually have a library, and that library shows us that they spent much of their time doing biblical interpretation, and much of their time, not half, but a good portion of their time, thinking legally about how to live their lives. And sometimes the law was a concrete thing, and sometimes it was more of an abstract thing, where they were thinking abstractly about what running the temple would be like, even though they didn't control the temple. And so this allowed them to sort of hypothesize about. The Essenes is usually E-S-S-E-N-E-S. E-S-S-E-N-E-S, the Essenes. So in Hebrew, Esseim, but the rabbis in rabbinic literature refer to a group called the Baitusim. The rabbis in rabbinic literature refer to a group called the Baitusim. The Baitusim. So there's the Prushim, the Tzdukim, and the Baitusim. Baitusim are less common. And the Baitusim, Professor Yaakov Zussman of Hebrew U proved definitively about 20 years ago that the Baitusim are the Essenes. That linguistically, there's a connection between Baitusim and Essenes. They're the same thing. So the third sect described by the rabbis are the Essenes, are the Dead Sea Scrolls sect. So in the past, there's been a lot of confusion about this. Now it's pretty clear. We know who the Essenes were. We know who the Dead Sea sect was. They're the same group. Where does rabbinic literature come from? So in the year 70, the temple was destroyed. The destruction of the temple, by the time, I mean, I told you that in the Second Temple period, they had communicated the ideology of centralized worship in Jerusalem, controlled by priests. That they had cemented that. That was part of the Torah that Ezra and Nehemiah were teaching the people. It's what they were studying still in Babylonia, the Jewish community that was in Babylonia. Now the temple is destroyed, and it's a major crisis in religious life. It's also a crisis in political life and national life. I mean, religion is not this kind of separable thing that we think of it now. Religion was identity. It was cultural, national, personal, political identity. It was everything. And out of the destruction of the temple, eventually the rabbis emerge. Eventually, because the first works of rabbinic literature that we have today are from roughly 200 CE. So they're from 130 years after the destruction of the temple. So our picture of the rabbis replacing the temple, which often sounds like, oh, they got together in a meeting the day after Tisha B'Av in 70, and they said, let's replace the destruction of the temple with Yavneh. The reason why you get this picture is because also there's a famous story in rabbinic literature itself about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai going and negotiating, giving up Jerusalem on behalf of the rabbis. It really feels like this substitution of one for the other, and it's not really how it happens. What happens is an organic development out of the sects of the Second Temple period emerges a group of similar scholastically oriented religious figures who are roaming around what's left of Israel. A lot of it is not around Judea anymore. A lot of it is further to the north, like if you've been to Caesarea, that was a major center for Jewish learning. Tiberias, things, Sephari, all these synagogue floors that they found in all these places. It's because these northern centers were now headquarters of Jewish cultural and religious life. And within this model, the sectarian model of separating yourself off and going and living in the desert and waiting for the apocalypse gets replaced with a new model in which you're living among everyone and you at least have the fantasy that you are going to be the leadership class for everyone. It's clear to us that during much of the rabbinic period, so I like to say that the rabbinic period stretches from 70 to 750. 70 is the destruction of the Second Temple. 750, or the middle of the 8th century, coincides with the rise of Islam, or I've been actually saying this a little differently lately. It coincides with the institutionalization of Islam in the Near East. So Islam starts in the 7th century. But what you see happening in the 8th century is that this nomadic, poorly organized, dynamic energy of this new religion, which is related to trade and all kinds of other things, starts to get real bones in the 8th century when groups of Arabic tribes set down roots in places and create empires. So the Abbasid Empire, which is headquartered in Babylonia, where there was a big Jewish community, plays a very important role in how rabbinic literature comes to be central. You talked about the Talmud being the central piece of Jewish literature. That only happens because at the end of the rabbinic period, there's a group of people, the Geonim, who are active between the 8th and the 10th centuries, and they are located in the headquarters, the capital city of the Abbasid dynasty. And at the same time as Islam is rising and becoming institutional and powerful, Judaism starts to become institutional, and they become powerful, and they become the centralized headquarters of Judaism because they're in the capital city. And so people from all over the Jewish world, whether they're in Yemen or in Egypt or in, I don't know, even Portugal, would write letters to Babylonia asking for guidance because Babylonia was now the headquarters. But that is a post-rabbinic phenomenon that transforms rabbinic literature and the Judaism it lays out into default Judaism. So from after the 8th century, you could say rabbinic Judaism is Judaism. But during the rabbinic period itself, which is the period of formation of the literature, this isn't true. Between 70 and 200, the picture you should have of what rabbinic learning looked like is closer to Taliban than to university, right? I mean, it's charismatic individual rabbis with a following of maybe 5 or 10 loyal students sitting around all day, studying like they did at Qumran, and producing 2 types of literature. So between 70 and 200, they were producing 2 types of literature. One type is the Midrash type, and one type is the Mishnah type. The Midrash type, which you talked about last week, is biblical interpretation. Very creative. There are lots of different types of biblical interpretation, but in general terms, Midrash is very creative biblical interpretation. So creative that it comes to replace the contextual interpretation of the Bible. So one of the things that happens as a result of rabbinic Midrash is that after you read the Bible midrashically, Jews don't go back to reading it non-midrashically for hundreds of years. They were so compelled by Midrash that Midrash becomes the way they understand the Bible. But in addition to Midrash, they also spend a lot of time thinking about law. Again, they come by this from 2 different places. They come by it because they get it from the sectarians, but they also get it from the Torah itself, which has legal materials. And they get it, especially in Babylonia, these other law codes were likely still around. There was still some kind of law schools for Babylonian speakers or whatever it was that might have been studying Hammurabi in those days. It might not have been so weird at the time for what the rabbis did. They spent half their time interpreting Jewish ideas from their canonical text, and the other half of their time articulating these ideas in legal terms. Yeah, John.
So I guess my question is, if there's no political sovereignty, why this obsession or focus on law when there's no, is it purely theoretical? There's no body politic, there's no sovereignty. What are you going to do with all this law? Or is it just academic?
So remember that rabbinic law includes the kind of criminal law or administrative law that you would need in a sovereign space. But if we did a statistical analysis, how much of rabbinic law is that really? So the Mishnah, which is the definitive work of rabbinic law, produced around the year 200 by Rabbi Judah the Prince on an oral basis, what he did was he collected the oral teachings of law that were circulating in the oral ether in Palestine in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and he organized them. The Mishnah is hyper-organized. It is the one work of rabbinic literature that is well organized. It demonstrates the rabbis were capable of organization. They choose not to be organized on purpose. The Mishnah is divided into 6 topical orders, right? And then those 6 topical orders are subdivided into topical tractates. And then those tractates are subdivided into topical chapters. So, you know, if in Midrash is so messy because you're allowed to read any biblical passage in light of any other biblical passage, or at least so it seems in later Midrash. So what this means is, if you want to know where the laws of taking a citron on the holiday of Sukkot are going to be found, they could be found in the section of Leviticus that talks about those laws, but a midrashic treatment of them could also be found in Genesis, attached to treatments of the fruit in the Garden of Eden. Or you could find a treatment of them in the Song of Songs, which talks about fruit and trees all the time, right? So Midrash is kind of messy, and Mishnah really well organized. So while you could really have a hard time finding, even if you had a book that you could open, because it was all oral, but even if you had a book that you could open, it would be hard to find what you would do with a citron on the holiday of Sukkot. But when it comes to the Mishnah, you take out the order that's about the calendar, you take out the tractate that's on the holiday of Sukkot, you take out the chapter that's about the 4 species, and there you go. You have a Mishnah that tells you what you need to know about the citron, right? So the Mishnah is extremely well organized. But the Mishnah does something that is to some extent shocking, though perhaps not in light of what I've said, and I'll explain. The Mishnah articulates its ideas independent of biblical sources or logical rationales. So the Mishnah lays out Judaism as a set of laws without justifying them by saying that they're found in the Bible, or without justifying them by saying that they're logically compelling. Which is curious because Midrash is all about justifying things in the Bible and justifying things through logic. So the fact that the rabbis produced this whole other literature, that again is a very helpful counterweight to Midrash because it's super organized, it's really helpful but it's also surprising because it does the opposite of every other work of rabbinic literature. It severs these ideas from their relationship with the past, and it makes it seem as though the rabbis are making a claim to their own authority. We are telling you what Judaism is. We have laid it out for you. Now, Rabbi Judah the Prince makes a curious decision within his Mishnah. He doesn't lay it out in a singular way. He preserves arguments between named rabbis. So forgive me if you've heard this example before. I've used this example in some contexts before. When I moved here, I took a driver's test because I'm from New York and I had to pass an Illinois driver's test. And I had to study the written manual because the laws are a little different in different states. In administrative law, they give you the manual and then you take the test on it. And I learned, which was shocking, I'm from New York City. In New York City, you're not allowed to make a right turn on a red light. But I learned that in Illinois, you're allowed to make a left turn on a red light in certain circumstances. Do you know that? What are the circumstances? One way to a one-way. So you're all excellent Illinois drivers. This was shocking to me. Now imagine if my shock had been compounded because the book I had been reading said you're allowed to do it, but Governor Blagojevich says you're not allowed to do it. This kind of confusion would give you a sense of what it means to read the Mishnah as a law code. Because the Mishnah is constantly telling you, this is pure, Rabbi so-and-so said it's impure. This is kosher, Rabbi so-and-so said it's not kosher. What is a reader who's interested in practical law to do with this kind of information? But you'll remember that I said that a lot of the tradition of studying law was not practical. It was scholastic. This was just something that they did. And so Rabbi Judah the Prince, probably to keep the peace in producing the definitive work of Mishnah, he wanted to keep the peace, and in order to do that, he wanted to preserve as much of the different traditions that were floating around among the different charismatic rabbis. People like Rabbi Akiva, famous Rabbi Akiva, or Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. These are famous names. He couldn't just decide between their traditions. If they disagreed about things, he felt like he had to preserve them. And so he created a model where you could have this kind of pluralistic legal context. What's interesting about it is that over the course of the rabbinic period, this perhaps accidentally emerging model of pluralism became for the rabbis a defining, identity-forming hallmark of what it means to be a rabbi. What it means to be a rabbi is to be able to balance the possibility that you could say something and its direct opposite and imagine that both of them are divinely authorized. That God's okay with both positions. Now, in a monotheistic tradition where there's one God, that is a shocking position to have. Yeah?
Why, if there's no authority for the Mishnah, no reference to Torah or anything else, why would the population accept it? Why would people buy it?
So the answer to that question is they didn't, right? From 200 to 700, there's no evidence that many people knew the Mishnah. Maybe the number of people who knew the Mishnah was only 100. Probably as many, I mean, maybe over several centuries it was 300 at most. You're not talking about major distribution of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was memorized. There were specific memorizers who would sit in a corner and you would consult them. I doubt that there were hundreds of these people around. And this is how the Mishnah was preserved. Yeah.
The Mishnah was, so all these different rabbis were, and they all had 4 or 5 students, and they were, how was it redacted into one document? How did that?
So there were at least 5 generations of rabbis from 70 to 200.
Okay.
Rabbi Judah the Prince, around the year 200, produced this document. We don't know exactly how.
So they sent each other manuscripts and they said, okay.
There are works of history that will try to give you stories.
Okay.
But these are all based on other texts that were written in either 400 or 700 or 900 or 1200 that are trying to produce stories of why. The truth is we don't know how or why. Our best guess is that Rabbi Judah the Prince was a uniquely positioned player. He was genealogically a descendant of the House of David. So he had royal blood in his family. He was recognized for that within the community. He was appointed by the Romans to be the official patriarch and representative of the Jewish community. So he was politically in control of the Jews of Judea. And he was a brilliant man who had studied with leading rabbis of his day. So those 3 things coalesced. He probably had the means and the opportunity and the motive to do this, to produce the Mishnah. And his production of the Mishnah is groundbreaking. You may be wondering, I have 10 minutes left and I haven't talked about the Talmud, right? You may be wondering about this. I mean, not 10 minutes left because we're going to actually read Talmud. That's what we're going to do in the last half hour. I'm going to give you some Talmud to read. But this is all by way of explanation of what the Talmud is. You would think that the production of the Mishnah would just end things. Once you have this beautifully articulated document which tells you what you need to know about Judaism in an incredibly well-organized fashion, that people would say, that's all I need. I'm good. Only that's not what happens. What happens is the Mishnah's format, its terse format without connection to Bible or logic, troubles the people who receive it. I actually have a work that I'm working on now, I've been working on for some time, which talks about the poetics of the Mishnah and how actually the Mishnah, if you read it carefully, actually communicates to the reader that there's much more depth underneath it. It's incredibly well written, this document. The poetics of it have not been properly appreciated. The Mishnah was put together, it's a brilliant work, and possibly because of the brilliance of the Mishnah, it forced the audience of people who received it to not just receive it in a passive way and just read it and accept it, but to receive it in an attack mode, where in order to read the Mishnah, what you have to do every time is you have to get at every clause and figure out, where did this come from? And where did this come from has two basic possibilities. Either it came from the Bible, or midrashic interpretation of the Bible, or it's some kind of logical principle that someone has come up with. But unless you can ground it in the Bible or logic, it has no basis. The Talmud is an exercise in explaining where these ideas of the Mishnah that are just articulated without explanation come from. And typically in a, okay, can we hand these out now? Hand these out. Yeah, we'll distribute these. Typically in a passage of Talmud, a typical passage of Talmud, I don't know, 8 times out of 10. A Talmudic passage, Talmud is always formally structured on Mishnah. The word Talmud, by the way, is synonymous with the word Gemara. The Talmud is the Hebrew, Gemara is the Aramaic. The reason why we use the word Gemara nowadays is because the Christian censors of the Basel edition made us eliminate the word Talmud from our Talmud because the word Talmud was considered anti-Christian. And since then, we've used the Aramaic substitute Gemara for Talmud, and Gemara has become the traditional term. So people who are traditional always say to me, why do you say the word Talmud? And I say the word Talmud because the traditional term is Talmud. It was changed in the 18th century, and I'm changing it back to what it was originally. Talmud is the original Hebrew word for the genre of writing in which this document is produced. There are 2 Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud, and both of them are the products of actual conversations that took place in the aftermath of the reception of the Mishnah. The Mishnah lands in this oral way, it gets published, and it triggers conversations. And the conversations are basically people reading this document and trying to figure out, where do these things come from? What is the basis for these ideas? So almost every passage of Talmud, the Talmud is formally structured on the Mishnah, and almost every passage of Talmud will start out by asking, how do we know this? And if 8 out of 10 passages of the Talmud start out, how do we know this? 9 out of 10 of those how do we know this passages have an answer in Midrash. The answer to how do we know this is a piece of biblical interpretation that explains it. Some of the biblical interpretation that is offered is dated from the early period, the period from before the Mishnah, the period before 200, the period where a lot of the stuff was floating around in the ether and they spent half of their time on Midrash, was very fruitful and produced some of the Midrash that Gary talked about last time. So some of this stuff is coming from that period, but some of it is also produced by the rabbis who lived after the Mishnah. So one of the things that happens as a result of the Mishnah has two massive reverberations, massive changes within rabbinic learning as a result of the Mishnah. One, the style of learning, the structure of how people go about their learning day changes. Used to be you'd spend half your time interpreting the Bible and half your time producing law codes. But now you have a new style of learning where you start with your law code and you start, where do you know this from? And then you go back and forth between the law codes and the Midrash. Law codes, Midrash, biblical verses, logic. This is Talmud. Talmud is this back and forth dialogical conversation. Now, it's a conversation that was happening in an active educational live mode, beginning with the production of the Mishnah, beginning almost immediately in the 3rd century. You have rabbis in both Palestine, Eretz Israel, and Babylonia, modern-day Iraq, who are gathering together and they're examining this material and they're doing this Talmud-style learning. 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations, 5, 6 generations of rabbis do this in Babylonia. In Palestine, it's only 4 generations of rabbis. 6 generations in Palestine, 4 generations of rabbis, and then somehow the Palestinian Talmud is produced. In Babylonia, it's 6 generations of rabbis, and then the Babylonian Talmud is produced. Now, the question of how the Babylonian Talmud is produced will have to be a topic for a different day, because it is a fascinating topic all to its own, and some of my most important and influential teachers have written the book these questions, and I love talking about them, but we don't really have time to talk about them because I want to now move this a little bit forward so that you have an understanding of what you're about to do, which is you're about to study some Talmud. What I've given you in the Talmud, let's hand out these other ones so that people will see them also. The Palestinian Talmud was known by medieval Jews as the Eretz Yisraeli Talmud. In Hebrew printed editions that began to be printed in the 16th century, they would refer to them as the Talmud Yerushalmi. But the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, is a misnomer because it's not from Jerusalem. It wasn't written in or around Jerusalem. German, yes, because German scholars in the 19th century, who were the first academics to study rabbinic literature, thought of that land area that we know of as Israel as Palestine. And so they coined the term Palestinian Talmud, and they've been using it since the 18 teens. And so we in the field use the term, but nowadays if you use the term Palestinian Talmud, everyone gets a little bit defensive.
No, I didn't mean politically. I just thought it meant some meaning.
Yeah. So what I've given you on one of these handouts is a fairly well-known passage of Talmud. I have modified this passage of Talmud to make it more readable for you. I've given it to you in English, first of all. The English that I've given it to you is from the Sefaria website, which has access to the Steinsaltz translation of the Talmud. I want you to take a look at this English translation and notice the relationship between the bold letters and the non-bold letters. What do you think the ratio is between the bold letters and the non-bold letters? 1 to 3, non-bold is 3 to 1 to 1 bold. Yeah, something like that, right? The bold letters in the Steinsaltz edition, also in the Art Scroll edition, the bold letters are the literal translation, and the non-bold is all of the extra work that the commentary, that the translation has to do to make this make sense. And that'll give you a sense of how difficult it is to study the Talmud in its original form, because
Is it bolded in the translation?
in the books, yeah, it's bolded, yeah. So I actually like that they bolded it because I actually like giving it to my students in literal form, because as a critical Talmudist, some of the work that I do is I read the text against the traditional commentaries. So Rashi's famous commentary has been the basis for most translations. Most translations assume Rashi's understanding of things. But Rashi's not always right in terms of his understanding of the original text, and you don't give yourself an opportunity to understand what the original text meant if you're always going to read it through Rashi's eyes. But you kind of have to, if you want to get a sense of what it's like to read it without Rashi incorporated, take out the Sansino edition, which doesn't have this kind of apparatus and is very difficult to use, partly because they're trying to give you literal translation, which is very difficult for the user to use. The passage I've given you is the unpacking of a famous Mishnah. The Mishnah talks about the 5 payments that are owed to someone in a case of battery. If someone damages someone else and injures them to the point of maiming them, they have to give them 5 payments. You'll see that there's a Mishnah, which you'll read together in Chavruta. You'll be able to pair off and read this Mishnah together. And then you'll have the Talmud, the Gemara. The Talmud is going to, I will tell you the overall structure. The Talmud here offers you countless reasons for how the rabbis know that when the Bible says eye for an eye is the punishment, it doesn't mean you actually knock out the eye. Now, what's strange about this is that from a historical perspective, it does mean that you knock out an eye, right? So the rabbis, midrashically, are having to do very important work. They think that eye for an eye is probably barbaric, don't want to do it, but their Bible says that this is what the law should be. They're using their midrashic tools and logic to get around this reading and show how eye for an eye really means value, compensation, money. So now, what goes on in the actual text, you'll notice in a couple of places that I've given you ellipses. There are ellipses because I've omitted whole sections. One of the things that makes the Talmud such a joy, beyond the bold, non-bold relationship, is the texture of argument. The Talmud likes to go down rabbit holes. So if it brings an argument and then there's a sub-argument, it will get lost in a discussion of the sub-argument for a page and a half before pulling back to the next argument. So if I don't delete this, you won't be able to see all of these things because this would go on for 12 pages. But the reason why people spend lifetimes studying Talmud in yeshiva is because the complexities of it are both, like you're basically pulling and pushing. There's depth in all kinds of ways, not to mention the depth that you could come to in terms of the manuscript traditions and the different variant versions of the text that have survived throughout history, which I'm not going to talk about now. But the other thing that I'll say is, and everything I've said so far is about the Talmud itself, the original work of literature produced by the rabbis who lived roughly between 200 and 750, finalized by the middle of the 8th century. Little things get added here and there after the 8th century, but mostly final by the end of the 8th century. It's the work that academics like myself, when we work on Talmud, we're trying to retrieve the original meaning of that text. In my biography, I call that the essential meaning of the text. So, if you want to get my book, you'll read more about that. But the Talmud today is famously associated with this page image. I assume that some of you have seen this kind of page image of the Talmud. It's on the flip side of, right? This is the page image of the Vilna edition, a specific printed edition of the Talmud produced in the 1880s in Vilnius, Lithuania. In my book, I talk about how this edition came to be the definitive one. I'm not going to go into that now. But what's happening on this page is that the central text is the Talmud, a version of, you're going to be reading, the English text you're going to be reading is just the central page. So what I've given you here, this is the actual page of the English that you're looking at. And actually, 90% of what you're looking at fits right here, which tells you something about the kind of density of the language. But then alongside it, what the Vilna edition captures so beautifully is it captures centuries of post-Talmud conversations in which the Talmud is central, and understanding what the Talmud means becomes the basis for scholastic life. So since the Gaonic yeshivas, which were active between 750 and 1000, what it has meant to be a leading Jewish leader, at least in religious terms, a rabbi, has meant that you're a part of a conversation that is centered around the Talmud and includes hundreds of years of additional layers of commentary, right? So if the Mishnah had 5 generations and the Babylonian Talmud has 6 generations, the texts around it are an additional 50 generations of conversation, and a student of Talmud in a traditional yeshiva will be intersecting all of those conversations with one another to try to figure out what this means. This is what I call in my book the enhanced Talmud. The enhanced Talmud is the attempt to understand the Talmud, not just the center text and what it meant historically, but the entirety of the conversation that has emerged around the Talmud that has existed for hundreds of years. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you some time now to read through some of these, I'd like you to read, oh, I didn't give you page numbers. I definitely want you to see the first page. I want you to see how it starts, how you start with the Mishnah and then you go to the Gemara. And I want you to read the second page as well. And then I think you should skip at that point to the final page.
The first, second, and final?
Yeah, the first, second, and final. And in the final one, I want you to skip to where it talks about Rabbi Eliezer. It is taught in a Braita that Rabbi Eliezer says. So, and it may make sense in the interest of time for you as a chavruta to read it to yourself and then discuss what's being said a page at a time. That might be a good way of going about it.
I want to pause this. Can I pause it? If I hit stop, will it end it or? That's. Oh yeah, that worked.
Good. Thank you.
Pause the video? No?
What?
Should I pause the video?
Yeah. Can you pause it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's pause button. All right.
Okay, so I want to bring us back now, and I want to bring us back to this text that you got a chance to look at, and you probably, if you haven't studied Talmud before, this might have been a very foreign experience to see these kinds of arguments that use a combination of biblical verses. There's good close reading, there's inferential reading, there's also like very creative ways of figuring things out so that the text should say something. So, for example, if you got to on the second page, as you transition from the first page to the second page, the verse states, "And you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, for he shall die." This indicates that it's only for the life of a murderer that you shall not take ransom. But you shall take ransom for one who severed another's extremities. Right? This kind of like emphatic interpretation, which is actually reading the Bible against what it originally historically meant. But this kind of careful attention to language that allows them to shift the meanings, it's seemingly very slightly semantically, but in very large ways. Now, you notice at the beginning, it cited a verbal analogy in the Torah as is taught in a baraita. Baraita is an Aramaic term. It refers to a term the rabbis produced this term. The term baraita is a term that means in Aramaic outside. Any text that comes from the Mishnaic period of time, from before 200, that was not in the Mishnah, is an outside text. And even though it wasn't in the Mishnah, it was still memorized, it was still orally distributed, it still floated around in the ether, and still could be used a century or two after. So in the 400s, they could pull out of their pockets a baraita that wasn't in the Mishnah. And one of the interesting innovations of Talmudic learning was that they canonized the period of time in which the Mishnah was produced. So anything that is considered from that period of time has the same canonical value. So when they ask a question from a baraita, they are asking from a text that they value as much as the Mishnah. And a baraita can come in different forms. A baraita can be a midrashic baraita, or it could be a mishnaic baraita. So all in this example, in this passage, they're all midrashic baraitas. They're all doing midrash work. They're all reading the Bible and interpreting it. But there are Talmudic passages where you'll just get one after the other of Mishnah-style baraitas, of additional law code information isn't found in the Mishnah that was just articulated by individual rabbis and recorded and remembered. Another thing I want you to notice how there's named attributions. You notice how like sometimes it gives you a name and sometimes it doesn't give you a name. So on the second page it says Rabbi Dostai ben Yehuda. We know that Dostai ben Yehuda was a student of Shimon Bar Yochai, a more famous rabbi. Incidentally, the next name after Dostai ben Yehuda is Shimon Bar Yochai. Their interpretations are remarkably similar, which makes you wonder if maybe the order should be reversed, if Bar Yochai's interpretation doesn't come first. We get the school of Rabbi Yishmael, but then as you're moving within the passage, as you're moving, you go from the school of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael is a Tana, is a pre-Mishnah rabbi who was active around the same time as Rabbi Akiva in the early 2nd century, so in the, let's say, 130s and 140s, Rabbi Yishmael. But then you jump. The school of Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia is a student of Rav. It makes him a 2nd-generation Babylonian Amora. His school would have been around 300. So you're now jumping from Palestinian sources to Babylonian sources, from 2nd century sources to 3rd or even 4th century sources. And it gets even more. The next line is Abaye says. Abaye is a 4th generation Babylonian Amora, would have been active around 320 or 330 CE. But he's reading, this principle is derived from that which was taught by the school of Chizkiah. Chizkiah is from the Tannaitic period. So now you have an Amoraic, a 4th generation Amoraic rabbi, interpreting something that he has in his tradition that's not part of the Mishnah, but it's from the Mishnaic period. You see how this stuff gets, it's moving forward in time, it's also moving backward in time. But I also want you to see something that's happening. So you have Abaye, and then you have Rav Zavid said in the name of Rabbah, or that's probably Rabbah actually. Rabbah is a 3rd generation rabbi, he's Abaye's teacher. Rav Zavid would be a contemporary of Abaye. And then Rav Papa is a student of Abaye's. He's a 5th generation Babylonian rabbi. So most of the time, actually, when you're reading the Babylonian Talmud and it lays out positions like this, it does it in chronological order, which might suggest either that it's kind of been layered over time, people have been kind of memorizing things as they were produced, or that someone who knows their history has been arranging it so that it shows up in order. Again, this gets into all kinds of questions about who wrote the Talmud and how that works. But it continues later on when it quotes Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi is a 6th generation Babylonian Amora, and so the text goes in order. Now, I don't have time to get into this, but if you want to on your own, the interesting thing about Rav Zvid and Rav Papa, those 2 paragraphs, the work that they are doing is actually not creative interpretation of the Bible. I mean, it is, but most of the creative work is actually interpreting the categories of the Mishnah. One of the things that happens over the course of the rabbinic period is that the Mishnah comes to occupy the central canonical space that had previously been occupied by the Bible, and would eventually, as you see in the Vilna edition, come to be occupied by the Talmud itself. The Mishnah was the primary study text of the rabbis who produced the Talmud, in the same way that the Talmud is the primary study text of all rabbis afterwards. But during the rabbinic period, it's the Mishnah itself, and so the same way you can emphasize a word in the Bible and turn the meaning this way or that way, you can emphasize things in the Mishnah. So both Abaye and Rav Zvid, both Rav Zvid and Rav Papa are using the overlap of the categories of damages found in the Mishnah as the basis for why the Bible means compensation rather than damages. Now, in some ways, this kind of makes our head spin. How does the Mishnah's category justify what the Bible, meaning of the biblical verse? To appreciate, you have to understand that what they've done is they've elevated the Mishnah up into the level of the canon of the Bible. And so they can, in fact, in their way of thinking, use the Mishnah to understand the Bible. I want to get to the end of this passage and show you, I know that I'm going over time, just please forgive me, I'm going to take a few more minutes. We finally get to Rabbi Eliezer. Eliezer comes at the end of the story, which would make you think what? That who is Rabbi Eliezer? You'd think that Rabbi Eliezer is when? You think he's 7th generation Babylonian Amor. You think he's coming out, he's after Rav Ashi, right? He should be. Rabbi Eliezer is one of the earliest Tanas, okay? Not only that, but Rabbi Eliezer is notorious in rabbinic literature for preserving the ideas found in sects like the Dead Sea Scrolls, like in the Dead Sea sect, preserving like really early understandings, Second Temple understandings of what the law was. And here we have Rabbi Eliezer saying, an eye for an eye refers to an actual eye, which makes you wonder from a historical perspective, aha, so during the sectarian period, when they read eye for an eye, there were at least some people who were still saying that's literal. But look what happens to this position in the Talmud. So the entire passage has been structured to really overwhelm you with midrash after midrash, which tells you it can't be literal. But the rabbis, they want to hide the ball a little bit, but they're too honest. They can't get rid of Rabbi Eliezer completely. They know that he exists. So they do have him exist in the end. They said that Rabbi Eliezer says it actually means literal. Now the anonymous voice of the Talmud, and now we'll have to have a whole separate conversation to talk about what the anonymous voice of the Talmud is. It's related to the question of who wrote the Talmud. The anonymous voice asks, Can it enter your mind that the verse is referring to an actual eye? Doesn't Rabbi Eliezer understand the verse like all these Tanaim who explain that the verse is referring to monetary payment? Well, first of all, most of these people are after him. Most of these people, like, he's not familiar with these midrashic interpretations. But the answer to that question is, of course he understands. But he's a literalist. He wants to understand what the Bible originally meant. And in his perspective, but look what the rabbis do. So first they use rhetoric to try to say there's no way, like it's absurd. There's no way Rabbi Eliezer could have meant this. Okay. Then they move on from rhetoric, and now we have Rava. Rava is a very prominent 4th generation Babylonian Amora. He is the most commonly cited rabbi in the Babylonian Talmud. Rava said in response, Rabbi Eliezer means to say that the court does not appraise the injured party as a slave to assess the compensation for the injury. What Rava is doing is fascinating. Rava realizes that there might be something, and we nowadays would obviously have all kinds of problems with slavery. But clearly there's some kind of divide between the Mishnah and its historical period and Rava writing in Babylonia a couple of centuries after the Mishnah, where he's starting to think maybe this idea of evaluating people's value based on the price of slaves, it's kind of icky. Like it's not a really great valuing technique. Maybe it's not something that should be done. I'm actually giving a paper about this at the AJS in Boston this Sunday. I'm going to give a paper on exactly this question about sort of this ick factor of slavery evaluation. So what Rava essentially does is he takes the challenge of Rabbi Eliezer as an opportunity. One of the things that happens in light of the Mishnah is you get the canonization of the earlier material such that later rabbis are not allowed, they don't feel entitled to disagree in a flat-footed way with earlier materials. So if you just had Rabbi Eliezer's voice, Rava would never say Rabbi Eliezer is wrong. Not allowed to say that in his own way of thinking of things. There's a few techniques you could use. You could say Rabbi Eliezer is one Tanaitic view, and there's these other Tanas that we all listed. That would be one view that the Talmud frequently does. But often the later rabbis don't choose that very direct way of dealing with problems. They choose interpretation. And they use the challenge of the contradiction as an opportunity for new meaning. Rava himself has a problem with this valuation, so he puts it in Rabbi Eliezer's mouth and says that what Rabbi Eliezer is saying when he means a literal eye is he doesn't like the evaluation where you take one price of a slave and another price of a slave and you subtract it, and that's the value of an eye. He wants people to get the actual value. He wants an assessor to come and assess the value of an eye. So what Rava has done is he's taken the opportunity of, Rabbi Eliezer couldn't have said this, and he's allowed it to completely change the meaning of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is now not about slave evaluations because we have another Tana who says you don't have to go with the slave evaluations. You can do something else entirely. But meanwhile, his colleague Abaye said to Rava, what are you talking about? How are you going to get, where are you going to get a monetary valuation? He appreciates that what the Mishnah is doing. Actually, there's an economics paper from a few years ago that celebrates the rabbis for using the market, because economists love markets, right? So the slave market is a great solution to the fact that people are different and have different values. The slave market is, these economists, and the more I read it, I'm just like, economists. What about the fact that it's degrading to take someone out to the slave market and get them evaluated? But the Abaye says to Rava, what alternative is there to the slave market? Free people don't have monetary valuation. Where are you going to get an assessor to assess the value of someone's eye? Does a free man have monetary value? Rather, Rav Ashi said, Rabbi Eliezer means to say that the court does not appraise the injured party as if he were going to be sold as a slave. Rather, they appraise the one who caused him damage. Rav Ashi is brilliant. What Rav Ashi, you remember, is the 6th generation Amora. So he's 2 generations after, probably about 50 years after Rava. And his treatment here manages to take Rava and reinterpret Rava. So Rava had reinterpreted Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Ashi is reinterpreting Rava. He's saying, no, what Rava really meant to say is that we don't like evaluating the victim. Doesn't feel right. And it's also not in keeping with eye for an eye. So what Rabbi Eliezer, when he said literally eye for an eye, he meant pretend that you're doing literal eye for an eye and evaluate the eye of the perpetrator. And actually, Rav Ashi's explanation is a beautiful explanation. It actually works really well on so many levels. It helps to explain the Mishnah. It has all kinds of, there's actually some value in eye for an eye because there's some legal symmetry to an eye for an eye, where you're actually compensating with like. Rav Ashi is actually there's a beautiful thing going on here. And this is the kind of texture that we get to see when we read the Talmud, because the Talmud has all kinds of things going on.
But what if the perpetrator is blind?
Aha, so I don't think I have this passage for you here. Or maybe, yeah, right here it is. Here, right? Yeah. Was there a blind person and a blind another? Right? So, right, that's a limitation with the lex talionis. It's a great idea of legal symmetry. You know, in the ancient Near Eastern codes, they took legal symmetry to other levels. They basically said, you know, if someone, God forbid, were to damage my child, or kill my child, the proper outcome might be killing their child. Right? That was one way they went in the ancient Near East, was to like have legal symmetry, perfect talion. But what that does is it creates vicarious punishment, where the person who's actually doing the harm is not getting punished. They're getting punished through their children. It's horrible. But the other thing that they sometimes did in the ancient Near East and the Hittite laws, they thought of these things entirely in utilitarian terms. So if someone's child gets killed, that child has a certain economic function. It has to be replaced. So they would offer a substitute person for that child who would now live in like the patriarchal clan to make up for the loss of work. So these are just different models of like how punishment is, like what is punishment based on. Legal symmetry is great in a lot of ways. It's very satisfying because it perfectly matches, but it offers really no restitution. You're not going to make anyone whole by killing someone else's kid. But it actually matches much more easily. So there's value there. One market approach. So I hope that this gives you a flavor of what studying Talmud is like. But to really study Talmud, you have to spend hours and hours and days and weeks and years, and even a lifetime. Going through this, I will also say, if you're interested in more about Talmud, a few years ago, I produced a massive open online course, a MOOC on the Talmud, which involved 24 video lectures. So there's a company called Coursera that offers these free online courses that you just have to register for. Over 15,000 people have registered for my online Talmud course. You don't have to finish it to register. So not everyone has completed it, but if you're interested in learning more, you don't have to do the whole course. There's also introductory videos there that might be more illuminating about certain details that I didn't get to tonight.
Where do we find that?
Coursera is the name of the Coursera, C-O-R-S-E-R-A. C-O-U-R-S-E-R-A. Coursera. And they have a Northwestern channel. It's on the Northwestern channel. But if you just Google Talmud MOOC or Talmud MOOC, Massive Open Online Course, you'll get my course.
And please help me thank Professor.
How you are organized, you are really very, very
Thank you.
intelligent.
Thank you.
I agree. Thank you. And I would also recommend the book Talmud and biography. Please look into that.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And I will stick around if you have additional questions. Though building is closing in 10 minutes.